This is an absolutely brilliant reading by the Spanish philosopher Jose Ortega y Gasset. It's called Meditations on Hunting, right? So, reflections on hunting. To do what is to separate oneself temporarily from what one usually is. To divert oneself, according to Ortega, is to separate oneself temporarily from what one usually is, right? To divert oneself. It's to change for a while our usual personality for another, which is more arbitrary. To attempt to escape for a moment from our real world to others which are not ours. Is this not strange? From what does man need to divert himself? With what does he succeed in diverting himself? This word diversion usually indicates only blank situations. At present, however, I am interested in underscoring a feature of hunting that runs contrary to what is usually understood by diversion. The word diversion usually indicates only comfortable situations. To the extent that, used carelessly, it connotes or it means ways of life completely free of hardship, free of risk, not requiring great physical effort nor a great deal of concentration. But the occupation of hunting, as carried on by a good hunter, involves precisely all of those things. Every good hunter has done what to hunting? Ortega says this. He says, it's not a matter of his happening to go into the fields every once in a while with his rifle on his shoulder. Rather, every good hunter has dedicated a part of his existence to hunting. And see, this is where the reading starts to get really interesting, where he talks about dedicating oneself to something. What is the most active thing that a man can do? Well, according to Ortega, now this is a more serious matter. Diversion loses its passive character, its frivolous or childish or silly side, and becomes the height of activity. For the most active thing that a man can do is not simply to do something, but to dedicate himself to doing it, right? This is where things get very interesting and kind of, this high point of kind of theory that we can approach culture with that Ortega's talking about. It's like, when someone loses themselves in a diversion by dedicating oneself to it, very interesting things happen. We become like a master. And, right, how do we develop skill? How do we become excellent at things, right? In a way, those hobbies and vocations and even things like the fine arts and sports and those kind of things, they're the sort of diversion that Ortega's talking about. And we can become very skilled by dedicating ourselves to these phenomena. What is the privilege and torment of our species? Ortega argues other living beings simply live. Man, on the other hand, is not given the option of simply living. He can and must dedicate himself to living, which is to say that he must hand over his life, or parts of it, deliberately and under his untransferable responsibility to specific occupations. Dedication is the privilege and torment of our species. And so, we have to ask ourselves, what do we dedicate to? What do we dedicate our lives to? What's really important to us that we want to develop skills and even mastery? How is life a poetic task? Ortega argues, so for man, existing becomes a poetic task, right? Poetic means like figurative, this literary, metaphorical, kind of dramatic, heroic task, right? Like the playwrights or the novelists, that of inventing a plot for his existence, giving it a character which will make it both suggestive and appealing. Right? That's where this reading just becomes so interesting, because you become like the lead protagonist in the drama, which is a poetic drama of your own existence. This is existentialism in a nutshell. If you want to kind of understand where existentialism is coming from, it's this very kind of articulation in which you are the social actor who has control over your being, right? And you narrate or you create this drama or this plot for your own existence. The fact is that for almost all men, the major part of life consists of what? The fact is that for almost all men, the major part of life consists of obligatory occupations, chores, which they would never do out of choice. And this is what we would call labor or work, right? I mean, most of us, how we earn our daily bread, right, is not something we would do if we weren't getting paid for it. Most of life is obligatory. Obligatory occupations, chores which they would never do out of choice. What most torments us about work, Ortega argues, and what most torments us about work, right? What we hate most about work is that by filling up our time, it seems to take it from us. In other words, life used for work does not seem to us to be really ours, which it should be, but on the contrary, seems the annihilation of our real existence. Given the choice, would we be laboring, right? And this invites an entire discussion about like leisure and freedom, and the Greeks had this idea of praxis, which was this idea of what a free person would do if they were truly free, right? I mean, like if you're really free and you have this leisure, what do you do? I think a lot of people don't know what the heck to do, so they get drunk and watch television, right? And that's the kind of interesting thing, right, between our work and our leisure. What is the one vocation or calling or mission common to all men or women, right? Ortega says there is one general vocation common to all. All, in fact, feel called upon to be happy. That's it. We all want to be happy. But in each individual, that general call becomes concrete in the more or less singular profile in which happiness appears. Happiness is a life dedicated to occupations for which that individual feels a singular vocation or calling or mission. Immersed in them, he misses nothing. The whole present fills him completely free from desire and nostalgia. It's a very, very interesting kind of philosophical position that he's taking. We all want to be happy, but the existentialists have this crazy notion of the calling or the vocation or the mission. And the vocation, the calling, the mission, what this really is the one thing that you're supposed to do, right? They like, if in this moment of vision, if you're perceptive, right, your spirit kind of beckons to you and calls out and says, I want to be a teacher, or I want to be a doctor, or I want to be, it's like a futural goal. That's what a calling or a mission is. Man is suspended between two conflicting repertories of occupations. So here's the human being suspended between two conflicting repertories of occupation, the laborious and the pleasing, right? Like a repertory is a group or like a series, right? So these are the two. We're suspended between the laborious and the pleasing. It is moving and very sad to see the two struggle in each individual. Work robs us of time to be happy, and pleasure gnaws away as much as possible at the time claimed by work. As soon as man discovers a chink or crack in the mesh of his work, he escapes through it to exercise of more enjoyable activities. How is pleasure related to happiness? Ortega says this. He says, so in my presentation of it as what it is, as a form of happiness, I've avoided calling it pleasure. Doubtless in all happiness there is pleasure, but pleasure is the least of happiness. So like, I think what he means here is like bodily pleasure and comfort. That's the least of happiness. What kind of occurrence is pleasure? Referring to Aristotle, happiness consists in what? And so this is what Ortega says. He says, pleasure is a passive occurrence, right? We don't have to work for it. It's the opposite of active. And it is appropriate to return to Aristotle, for whom happiness always clearly consisted in an act, in an energetic effort, right? So pleasure is passive, whereas happiness is active. It takes energy. We have to work for it. And that's a big difference. What do etymologies enable us to discover? Well, what is an etymology? An etymology is the history of a word, right? The etymology, you can look up the etymology of a word in a dictionary. It will give you like the root language. Say maybe it comes from Latin, and it might even tell you the date of, right, that it switched over from Latin to English. So that's what an etymology is. So he says etymologies are not merely of linguistic interest, right? They're not merely of language interest. They also enable us to discover situations really lived by man which remain preserved with the full freshness of present time, like the flesh of the mammoths preserved for millennia and the Siberian ice, which has been eaten by present day men. And so what he's saying here is like word dictionaries and word histories give us a kind of representation of the past that offers us a kind of window into how they really lived. What is the history of the word sport? This is interesting. He says the word sport had entered the common language from the Guildhall language of Mediterranean sailors, whose hard life at sea stood opposite their pleasurable life in port. Sport, in Spanish deporte, is to be in port, deportu. But port life is not only the sailor planted on the dock with his hands in his trouser pockets and his pipe between his teeth, staring obsessively at the horizon as he expected islands to blossom on its liquid line. There are, first of all, the interminable or never-ending discussions in the port taverns between sailors of the most diverse nations. These conversations have been one of the most efficient organs of civilization. So, sport, right? The history of the word sport is that it kind of came from Mediterranean sailors, and it meant to be in port. And the reason it is so interesting in an intercultural communication class is because sport had to very directly do with the discussions and the storytelling and the communication of sailors in Mediterranean ports. And he goes so far as to say it was one of the most efficient organs of civilization itself. What is foreign to the essence of hunting? Well, this is a technological argument, and he says progress in weapons is foreign to the essence of hunting. And he says that reason is not a primary ingredient of it, since hunting cannot substantially progress. And he continues, he says, this is so true that hardly had the weapon been perfected when all urgency for putting an end to the animal by whatever means disappeared. That is to say, hunting became a sport. And so, I mean, you could think about it, like that deer out there, you could use like a super scope, and I mean, like there, like the animal is incapable of figuring out ways to negotiate our technology. So we have to lessen our technology to hunt, is what he's saying. According to Ortega, what is the true significance of the word man, right? And I really think, this is sexist. Of course, he means human. The capacity to be one after another, an infinite number of different things, without one single imaginable thing being excluded on principle from the realm of possibility, is the true significance of the word human. What must we do to dominate an occupation, right? What do we need to become a master? That's what, this is what we want to know. It's a very interesting question. And he says this, he says, we must immerse ourselves wholly and heroically in an occupation in order to dominate it, to be it. What really matters to you? What do you want to be an expert in? What do you want to master? What is alertness for Ortega? Ortega says this, he says, the hunter knows that he does not know what is going to happen, and this is one of the greatest attractions of his occupation. Thus he needs to prepare an attention of a different and superior style, an attention which does not consist in riveting itself on the presumed, but consists precisely in not presuming anything, and in avoiding inattentiveness. It is a universal attention, which does not inscribe itself on any point and tries to be on all points. There is a magnificent term for this, one that it still conserves all its zest and vivacity and imminence: alertness. The hunter is the alert man. And so this idea of alertness as a metaphor is so interesting. To be alert is to kind of always be ready, right? The hunter is the alert, always at a kind of universal attention, because you don't know when something's going to happen, and you don't know for sure what's going to happen, but you want to be ready for it to happen. And that's not just in hunting, that's like in life. I mean, you have to be ready to, I mean, that's what is it, the time to strike is when the iron is hot. And what that means is you need to be like fully capacitated and ready to act at the appropriate moment in the appropriate way.